Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review American Gods, Season 3, Episode 5. So, as if that. Anyways, I'm going in here talking about this episode. Recently, for me, I thought that this episode was, honestly, for the most point, another filler or killer of time, to be brutally honest. I think that there was a lot of things where, like, they had just really bullet points of what to do for this episode. And so when doing that, you could feel like there was bullet points for this episode, and everything was to be stretched out in between that to get to those parts. And really, none of the things that got on within this episode had anything to do with the war. Like, man, I can remember the time when ultimately the war actually mattered on this show. Man, when are we going to get to that war by the time that this show is already canceled and we're never going to get to this war ever? Isn't it quite obvious by now that everyone who was fans of the show have probably left, sadly? Um, and I think that that's kind of heartbreaking when looking at it. It's like, man, this show was intriguing to a lot of people, but I think now a lot more people would be more interested in watching a review on it rather than actually watching the show. Um, which ultimately, like, I appreciate. I really do. I appreciate anybody wanting to come on and getting the consensus of what the heck was going on with this show, and ultimately, we could all theorize and just kind of like say like what the heck is going on with this show, reasonably. So when going on into this, we on the very last episode had Larry Hutchinson, who ultimately is seemingly a curator of the hospital that ultimately the character Demeanor is at. And ultimately, that character is going to be otherwise tied into this episode a little bit more. It seems like he's going to have his own little part to play in this episode. We also have it to where reasonably we have the conclusion of what is to happen to Bilquist, and ultimately it didn't really seem that after we get the conclusion of Bilquist that actually legitimately goes anywhere. It's just like, oh, okay, well that happens, and then so let's move on to something else because we gotta get to do this now. So there's so much about this show that feels like they are actually like tying loose ends, but when looking at it, it's also they're not doing like there's still a loose end to be had with this with Bilquist. There's still a loose end to be had. Like it kind of feels like, hey, yeah, we're doing something, but like we're not putting 100% of the effort into like solving every little piece of the puzzle. And that is what the next episode is going to be for. That is what the next thing is going to be, to ultimately just stretch out the fact that like we need more story to tell. Because ultimately, there's some characters that they had gotten rid of, and there's other characters that they had changed slightly for reasons we don't quite understand. And I really think that this episode is really using the least amount of cast that they can possibly have. Uh, or just a cheaper cast, it seems. It seems like they are reasonably trying to cut the budget of this show to either make up for the fact that The Cove or the new normal, if you know what I mean, or reasonably they are just trying to ultimately just say it's like, hey, we ultimately just kind of want this show to wrap up. And that is going to be sad because reasonably they're not going to actually resolve anything, which I'm assuming is like, I'm assuming that what's going to happen is they're just going to milk story out and they're never going to actually get to the actual war part. They're not actually going to get to the actual war. It's never going to happen, this war. So that's ultimately what I'm thinking is happening in this episode, or what is to lead up to probably be the fact that the the time that the show ends, the very last episode will probably say, hey, yeah, we're going to get to the war now. And yeah, like this will be the last episode of us saying, like, the war is happening now. And then the show will end and they'll never actually get to the war, is what I think will actually happen. That'll be a goofy way to end the show. But when looking at it, I think that they're probably looking at maybe shifting this show to go elsewhere. I know that there are some Stars shows that ended up going on to like Netflix. I think Ash versus Evil Dead ended up shifting gears to be on Netflix. I've been watching Ash versus Evil Dead, um, noticing that there's Stars logos everywhere. So I'm like, oh, okay, so Stars must just be shifting their stuff onto Netflix just to try to get more people to ultimately watch their stuff, when really and honestly and truly looking at it. So ultimately, knowing Ash versus Evil Dead is never going to actually be another. They're not going to do another season of that because Bruce Campbell had said, like, dude, I'm done. Like, I'm exhausted. So when looking at it, I'm sure that recently, like American Gods, if they shift to Netflix, I doubt that it's going to be like, oh, we're going to reboot this show and it's going to be like Lucifer and so on and so forth. So where they're going to do just one more season and then probably call it a wrap after that. But anyways, so yeah, there's really nothing going on in this show, this episode. Hence why I'm just kind of like stretching to even talk about other things besides this episode, because there's nothing going on. There's like there's like a couple different stories in here, but when really looking at it, we ultimately get to find out what Odin had. What was the reasoning for him being all crazy and stuff when ultimately he was to have that bar being blown up and so on and so forth. So let's ultimately go into the spoiler terms of this episode. Let's really kind of siphon this all out and get it all done. And yeah, so let's go into that spoiler time. Let's ultimately bust out the double five to otherwise call this one a day. But anyways, I think really there are some interesting, like, there's some interesting characters in this show, but when looking at it, interesting characters does not equal an interesting show. You gotta have a good story with these good characters. I think Shadow Moon is a good character. I think Bilquist is a good character. It's just that they're doing nothing. And so ultimately, there's only so long where your audience is going to care about or invest in a character that is done in a story that does not matter. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So we have it to where in a past time where we have it to where ultimately it seems that there is a magician of sorts that is putting on a act. It ultimately seems that this magician ends up being outshone by some uh, different and or brand new act. So we end up finding out that it seems that Technical Boy is putting on some robotic act to make it to where ultimately this robotic thing could ultimately do some tasks, could beat somebody in chess and all kinds of other things and stuff along that nature. We end up finding it that this magician is ultimately saying it's like, well, you need this robotic act to do much more than what it's actually doing. And so we have it to where ultimately Technical Boy is saying, well, I don't think I can really sink any more money into this whole thing. I've sunk my whole entire life savings into this robot, and so I don't think there is anything else that I could make it do. But we end up having it to where Technical Boy ends up going and putting together an act of playing chess with some girl, and we end up having it to where this magician ultimately is jealous of, again, this Technical Boy's success. To ultimately, he ends up showing the real true solving uh, of this robot, which actually has it to where ultimately the magician ends up breaking this one part of the robot to showcase that there is a man inside, ultimately to showcase that this whole act is really a ruse. It's just an actual person just in a robot body trying to solve or trying to play chess with somebody, and so it's not a real robot, it's just a normal man. And so ultimately we have to where everybody ends up going like, oh, boo-hoo, no, I don't like that. So we end up just having that robot being used in a earlier part of time to ultimately bleed into current time, where eventually the technical boy still has this robot but is using it for a different purpose, which I don't quite even understand. So, isn't that great? So, we end up because ultimately I was just like, what is it? What is the purpose of this? As well as any number of other things. So, we end up having it to where reasonably Technical Boy and Shadow Moon are on their way to finally rescue Bilquist. Ultimately, they end up having it to where Shadow Moon and Bilquist, or Shadow Moon and Technical Boy, are making their way to run through all these goons and stuff along those lines. And while that is going on, we ultimately have it to where Bilquist is ultimately having people kind of talk to her and want information and stuff like that. And we have it to where Bilquist is talking to Ocean, and this Ocean girl is using her water like powers to ultimately take down all of these guys. And so by the time Technical Boy and Shadow Moon make it to Bilquist, basically Bilquist has already freed herself with the help of Ocean. So we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon ultimately goes and opens up and finds that Bilquist is perfectly fine. We end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon came to Bilquist for answers, and of course Bilquist knows that. She ultimately asks him, like, well, like, you want to understand things of your past. You want to understand things of your memories, your dreams. And that's really just what gets resolved through that whole notion. Just, hey, yeah, I rescued you, and you want to know about your dreams, but you won't really know much about it. Eventually, it'll happen. Because ultimately, we have it to where Shadow Moon has to do more stuff. And so, reasonably, we're not going to narrow down to what is all going to be resolved right here and now out of all of this. So, we also end up having it to where now Shadow Moon has to focus on freeing his Pop Pop, which ultimately means he has to free Demeanor, which ultimately means now he has to go and try to get Larry Hutchinson to ultimately release Demeanor and or like-mindedly Odin. Because we find out that Odin had been faking his craziness. The craziness where he was at the bar and losing his effing mind, talking about a monkey crapping in his pants and all kinds of weird absurdities. We end up having it to where in this episode we find out that he was just faking all that to just get closer to Demeanor. Because supposedly Odin said that Demeanor was really his only really and true wife out of all the wives that he's ever had. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Shadow Moon and Odin's fiance end up trying to figure out how to break Demeanor out because Odin is much of their concern. So we end up having it to where Odin's fiance and Shadow Moon go and do this like Mission Impossible approach to trying to get Larry Hutchinson to otherwise release Demeanor. So we end up having it to where Odin's fiance gives Shadow Moon some certain phone that would ultimately connect to Odin's fiance when ultimately would uh, ring for any number. So we end up having it to ultimately. So we end up having it to where Odin's fiance puts a blonde wig on and goes and uh, ends up taking the case from Larry. And so we end up having Larry just going, "Oh my god, my case, my case. Oh, how could my case be so lost?" And so ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon, who has a, I guess, Australian accent, which I'm assuming maybe that's his actual accent, we have it to where Shadow Moon comes in and ultimately says, like, well, hey, like, I can give you my phone. It's a company phone, and ultimately you can call the police. And ultimately, I'm leaving out of town. So ultimately, hey, how about you just mail this phone to this certain address once you're done with it? So we end up having it to where Larry ends up taking this phone and calling 911, and the 911 leads to Odin's fiance, which is ultimately just strolling around. She's taking off her wig, and ultimately she's putting an earpiece in to ultimately, I guess, disguise herself as yet another person. We ultimately seemingly have it to where it seemed that Shadow Moon had collected the briefcase and ultimately had given the briefcase to uh, Odin's fiance, all while it seems that they know every little bit of information on Larry. We eventually have it to where Shadow Moon calls Larry to ultimately say, hey, yeah, the jig is up. Ultimately, I want you to release Demeanor uh, within X amount of days, because ultimately we find out that Larry can't. It'll take Larry 3 days to be able to get Demeanor out of psychiatric care and whatever and what have you. And so they also want a transfer of seemingly $100,000 into a Cayman's account, because ultimately it seems that uh, really the real thing that they wanted was Demeanor, but also when looking at it, you always have to go for money just because it's always the thing to do. And plus, this war needs money anyways. So why not just have a money that why not have money that ultimately is going to eventually bring into this war for whatever reason. So we end up having it to where reasonably Larry ends up agreeing to all this stuff that they are going to do, and reasonably that's just the real crux of this entire episode, really. We have it to where also um, Salim and uh, Salim and Laura also have something to do in this episode, um, because reasonably they are reflecting on the fact that ultimately Mad Sweeney is dead, basically mentioning that Salim and Laura reasonably don't have much to do right now, but Laura is still on the path of wanting to kill Mr. Wednesday, wanting to kill Odin, and so we have it to where ultimately Laura is still just holding around the 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 remains of Mad Sweeney, and so reasonably we have it to where we find out, I guess, some of the blood of Mad Sweeney had gone into Laura, hence why she's back from the dead, evidently. And so we are to ultimately just go in here and have Laura and Salim ultimately kind of contemplating what are their next moves. We have it to where Laura is saying that, like, why don't you go skydiving, or why don't you just like go on an adventure? It's like why? Because we have it to where Salim is like, well, what am I gonna have to do? Should I just go back to just selling trinkets? What kind of life is that? So we end up having it to where Laura and Salim are talking to Ibris, and Ibris ends up giving him his car, and ultimately just saying like, "Hey, you guys don't have to steal a car anymore. I'll give this car to you, and you guys can go off." So we really have it to where Laura and Salim are just going on and talking about what their next things are, but it doesn't really seem like there's cementingly a real thing that they're really doing. It just seems like they're just kind of putzing around. Um, so yeah, like really, this review is probably going to be very, very short, just because there's not much to talk about in this episode because everybody's journey is kind of very flimsy, and a lot of it is just kind of there's no real dialogue in this episode that ultimately matters. And plus, all of it could be easily said by saying all this stuff. So yeah, like that's hence why this is probably going to end up being a really short review of this episode. Uh, because ultimately we have to confirm where Laura was, which ultimately was in purgatory, and Salim has to confirm that, but ultimately Salim also has to confirm what happened to Mad Sweeney, and we actually have to see the ashes, and we have to see Laura picking out the lucky coin that ultimately had been enlodged in her body. So ultimately, I'm assessing, is Laura going to be the new leprechaun? Is she ultimately going to be? Is she going to be what would be the equivalent of Mad Sweeney now? Like, what is going on with that? Are we gonna have it to where Laura is going to try and resurrect Mad Sweeney? Because ultimately, I feel like that should still be a thing, but I don't think anyone could do that. I just don't think that there reasonably is going to be a point in time where we are going to revive this character, which I honestly think that they should, because reasonably I think he was probably the best character out of a lot of people. I think that this character was making this show really fun, and to kill him off made no sense, but I'm assuming that's what happens in the novels. That's what happens in the book. So, going on into this, yeah, like, it's all I got. It's all I got to say. Recently for this episode, everything was done so there was a lot of stuff that I had to like cut out of saying just because there was not much going on. If anything, we had it at some points where Odin was talking to Carol or Demeter to ultimately just kind of get her to be swayed to otherwise come and do and help him and be a part of his stuff. But that kind of happened more onto the last episode than this episode. And ultimately, we have it to where Odin is calling uh, for Shadow Moon to come to ultimately try and free Demeter and him. And ultimately, there is some interesting point where Shadow Moon ends up just kind of wheelchairing Odin around, and we have it to where ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon and Odin go to this greenhouse to talk about their plans, but like reasonably, that's plans, that's whatever, that's the only thing that I hadn't talked about. So yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Reasonably, even like some of the stuff was just kind of stretching, just because reasonably I try to make something over a quarter amount, but when looking at it, yeah, there's not much to talk about in this episode. So I'm gonna get out of here. Um, as far as speculation goes, the only thing that I could probably say is that who cares about the war anymore? Basically, it's just about like Shadow Moon and his journey, and that's about it. Even to the point where I think Shadow Moon, towards the very end of this episode, goes back into the Wisconsin town, and I'm like, oh my god, so we're going to get back to more of that story? Great! That is going to be the most boringest thing. Because, yeah, like, Shadow Moon ends up just going back to Wisconsin or back to the lakeside, and I'm just like, oh my god. So we have more of this story to look forward to of just Shadow Moon back lakeside. Great for the next how many ever episodes. So yeah, I think with that, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.